Kia ora and welcome to the Niggly Niche Cast. This is the Diggly Dude Dad, Dr. Papatoy Panther, Mr. Slippers here with the Wobbly Wildcard for another episode of Niche Cache Podcast, otherwise known as the Niche Cast. Now we've got a special little podcast here today because the Wobbly Wildcard is rather knowledgeable about the Aotearoa Breakers and their vibe that they've been putting off in 2019. So what we're going to do is we're just going to get a rundown from the wildcard for all you casual Kiwi sports fans, or if you're a Breakers diehard fan. The wildcard has been all over this icky vibe from the Breakers since things changed, which was kind of earlier this year, and he is over it like a rash. He has kind of predicted that all of this will happen at some stage, so now I bring in the Wobbly Wildcard. Wobbly Wildcard, I'm not going to ask you about the weather. I'm not going to ask you how you're doing. I'm going to ask you, what did you have for dinner last night?
Oh, what did I have for dinner last night? Last night was a Monday, so last night was a bit of a chunky one because I'm spending like 95% of the day on Mondays. All morning watching NFL and trying to get a kickstart in my football writing, and then all afternoon and evening writing about football. So reheated mac and cheese was for dinner yesterday. It wasn't one of my best. It wasn't one that I will look back on fondly, but it did the job. It got me to not die overnight of starvation, so that's always a positive, I suppose.
Nice. Nothing wrong with a bit of Monday night mac and cheese. Now, the Breakers. I don't know where you want to start, Wildcard, with your observations on what is happening in the Breakers. I'll kind of set it up, and then you can just take it anywhere and break it down for myself and any of the listeners, just to educate us on the situation at the Breakers. Recently, things came to a bit of a climax, in a way. You had that Glenn Rice Jr., he got into some trouble after being a troubled athlete, professional athlete elsewhere, and then the Breakers signed him in all their glory and got into trouble. And then there's just been another story, basically overnight. Tom Vodonovich got into some trouble on an airplane as well. We'll start with this, Wildcard. How are you viewing these latest misdemeanors in the context of the bigger, wider Breakers picture? Now, obviously, we're talking mainly off-court antics here. You can tell us how this is all affecting the Breakers on the court, but how do you view these most recent antics in that wider Breakers context that you have been exploring this year?
Within the wider context is pretty, I think that's a pretty valuable thing to be able to look at, because I think as we've reached, a tipping point with the public perception now, where it's watching Jason Pine tweeting about it on Twitter. I'm seeing an ex-player said something, the dude Andrew Dewhurst was talking about how sad things have become. Journalists are talking there's this big it's now common knowledge that this Breakers situation is a bit of a bloody train wreck, but the tipping point didn't happen this weekend. This is the consequences of just months and months of build up. The tipping point, for some would probably say the tipping point came when Dylan Boucher left, because at that point you had the last person who was a leader in the old regime. I mean, you still had Mike Fitchett, who waited a few more weeks before he left, but I mean, an assistant coach doesn't swing anywhere near as much power as the general manager. But when Dylan Boucher left, then suddenly okay, we're no longer in any sort of transitional point here. We're this is a completely new club to what it used to be. But I think the tipping point happened a few months earlier than that, when Kevin Braswell was made redundant, and just the lack of focus on that was astounding to me. It took a long time. I understand it was dragged out because of legal processes, and Braswell's never really come out and talked about what happened. But as best I can ascertain, and I'm not saying this is exactly what happened, but it seems to me, and it seems to be what people are saying, is that like he was 1 year into a 3-year coaching contract. He was made redundant because that way it'd be easier to get rid of him. I assume because then you can like not pay him as much as well. And Braswell then sued the club that he used to work for to try to get the money that he should have been paid out for being, for being sacked. And they're like, no, we didn't sack you, we made you redundant. Which is why they then hired a director of basketball to replace him and not a head coach, which was like, oh my god, like, the pretense of that, like the presumptuousness of just running along with this like obvious sham of it. Like, he's the head coach. I've continued to write about him as the head coach, Dan Shamir. I don't even think he's a bad head coach. I think actually the way he's conducted himself through all this, question marks about the success on the court, but it's too early really to judge him, and just too much everything else going on to be able to make individual calls about things that are going on the court. But it's, yeah, we might come back to this. It's pretty obvious that the on-court stuff is being absolutely tarnished by everything else. And, like, of course they're going to be a team that's losing more than they're winning when everything that's going on around is going on. But, yeah, Dan Shamir is the coach, but they're not calling him the coach. And it was, like, that whole thing was probably the tipping point to me. To where things had changed beyond a point where there was still that connection with what was going on before. And as Alex Pledger said on Twitter, it was a dynasty. Like, coming in and changing everything, okay, they needed to be more, like the financial side of things, more business savvy, and that's the direction the league was going in anyway, under, I think there's a new commissioner or something, or in any way, in the last couple of years, the NBL has definitely made more of a trend towards that side of things. But, yeah, they were doing things pretty well in the past, and it's not purely about the lack of connection with Kiwi basketball and not looking to be as, keeping those links between promoting basketball in this country and giving opportunities to Kiwi guys at the expense of others, which that's the other thing why this feels so drastic, is because when Paul Henare was in charge, he was doing the exact opposite. But the problem is the Breakers made a lot of win-now decisions under this thing, and making win-now decisions at every little crossroad, sort of erode the idea of a culture behind this. And this is a lesson I've learned, I think, over this time, is when team officials and stuff like this, the guys who make the decisions, make calls specifically about how they're going to win as opposed to how they're going to build a culture that is going to promote winning. There's just not a lot of substance beneath that if you ignore all that kind of thing, and you might win, but it's not going to be sustainable. And that's a feeling I've had all throughout the season. But oh my god, like, count all the things that have gone wrong, it's stunning, isn't it? Like, that's basically where I'm at with it. I don't know, I can get a lot deeper. Which direction should we go in with this?
Up to you, mate. I maybe just bounce off this, because from my perspective as someone who loosely follows the Breakers, I don't have a lot of bandwidth to invest in the Breakers, but we talk about the Breakers together, and I get your perspective on the Breakers, and obviously I trust your perspective and how you observe the Breakers. It seems like there's just been a continual disintegration process. And you, like, it kind of seems like there were a couple of junctures where perhaps things could have been righted or corrected, and obviously certain junctures things could have been done a lot better. But the weird thing is how it's just flowed, and it's not like flow state flow where you just go with the flow and like you're in the moment and all of that. It's a flow of disintegration,
it's a snowball rolling down a hill.
Yeah, like obviously there's other ways to paint it, like ramifications and consequences and stuff like that, but one bad decision flowed into another, and then that kind of manifests itself into situations where it's not like a bad decision from the Breakers, but shit just doesn't work out. Because I can see how many people would think that signing Glenn Rice Jr. might be a bad decision, but I've also seen numerous times where those type of professional athletes turn things around. And it was interesting hearing the owner guy, Matt Walsh, he was saying, this is something that kind of sums it all up, Wildcard. Matt Walsh was talking about how he believe the Breakers had the system and the infrastructure to ensure that Glenn Rice Jr. was in the best position to turn his life around and just contribute as a professional basketball player. Now, that infrastructure was disbanded by Matt Walsh. So, like, maybe if Glenn Rice Jr. came to the Breakers under the old regime, that's a culture, that's an environment where I feel confident that troubled professional athletes can come in and become better humans and grow and not get in trouble and just epitomize professional sports. Now, certain things have changed that, well, it's kind of delusional to think that the whole structure and culture that you disbanded is going to be able to support this player. Like, that's crazy. But it's just to me, it seems like a case of like bad decisions snowballing, as you said, and then manifesting in other things going wrong. And to me, that insight from Matt Walsh, where he believed that the current Breakers regime, culture, environment was going to help Glenn Rice Jr., like, that kind of sums it all up, because he has created a whole new culture, a whole new environment, a whole new Breakers that appears to be doing the complete opposite. Like, shit is hitting the fan in a major way that we've never seen before.
Yeah, 100%. I saw those same comments and I just had to laugh. And I don't know if this is like just damage control at this point, because they should never have signed this guy in the first place. Like, there were just too many red flags. The idea that he might do well playing under a coach he's familiar with, because he played with Dan Shamir before in Israel. Well, what did he do when he played with Dan Shamir in Israel? He assaulted a teammate in the locker room that Dan Shamir was supposed to be presiding over. And like I've said a few times, like I don't mind Dan Shamir. I think he's got the potential to be quite a useful coach. He's not the guy I would have hired, just for obvious reasons of he's coming from so far away. And just, this is like what you sort of said before about individually, a lot of these decisions are justifiable in a tunnel vision sense. Like, if you just look specifically at this, but when you combine them all together, there's just too many things that are contributing to this not being a winning basketball team. And when you're sacrificing the long-term vision, when you're sacrificing the long-term vision is sacrificed, as they won't say that that's true, but when you look at it, like, you bring in RJ Hampton for one season of super hype and big focus from overseas. And what's the consequence of that is that Shea Ely, a guy who you developed, homegrown, former Sixth Man of the Year, was he Sixth Man of the Year or was he Most Improved? I forget, one of the two of them. He's suddenly asked for a release because he doesn't see where he's going to get his playing time anymore. So there's a guy who would have been under contract for, he could have played his whole career at the Breakers if he wanted to. Well, that's the sacrifice you make for a single year for a guy who might not even play out this year. Like, at this point, what's keeping RJ Hampton in town? His dad's probably sitting there being like, what have we got ourselves into? RJ, come on, mate. Like, maybe, and this was something that was talked about at the start of the season, there is the opportunity for LaMelo Ball and RJ Hampton to leave a little earlier on their contracts and to get involved in the, like, how they, before the draft, guys, and after the college season, guys just go around doing, like, tours of facilities and stuff like that and working out in front of scouts and stuff like that just to bump up their draft stock and kind of things, some organized sort of programs and stuff like that. So that's certainly, like, at this point, why would RJ Hampton hang around through all this? What's helping him at this point? Maybe he's, in it for the long haul. I don't know. I got no idea what he's thinking. That Athletic article that was written about this whole thing didn't paint it in the best light. But yeah, like where was I going? I think Dan Shamir has the potential to be okay as a coach, but well, let's just look at the on-court stuff and why. Like, this team is 2-7 right now. There are a lot of reasons why they're 2-7. They have a coach who has never coached in this league before, who's from a different culture of basketball. He's coached his whole life in Israel up until now. He has an assistant who's Israeli-American, but, mostly from the Israeli system there. He has Seiko Coronel as well as an assistant who's an NBL guy in New Zealand, but has never coached at this. So you got a head coach and two assistants who've never coached in the NBL before. You've got injuries across the board. Like, this is something that you're hiring guys who are inexperienced, and that's a problem, and you're not giving them time to adapt, and that's a problem because you have to go win now because of the RJ Hampton thing, because this is the one time when this focus is all going to be on you, which is why I don't think they ever should have got rid of Kevin Braswell in the first place, but maybe there was more to that story than we realized. I don't know. The injuries, Rob Lowe busted his face and is out indefinitely. Finn Delaney only played his first game this weekend away in Perth, which was the 9th game of the season. Jared Weeks has missed a game or two. I remember Aotearoa Jock having to play through flu at one point. Who else has been injured? Tom Abercrombie missed most of the preseason with an injury. Not Sick Henry, but Scotty Hobson, of course, currently out injured, which is why Glenn Rice came in the first place. So you've got guys drawn from all, like, you've got the 3 imports, you've got a 4th import as well with RJ Hampton, effectively. So an 18-year-old starting point guard, as skilled as he is, as athletic as he is, there's obvious detriments to having a teenager running your offense there. That's another variable that's not, that's just chucking everything up in the air there. Guys just drawn from all over the world. The 4 imports, you've got Australian, you've got a Sudanese, Lebanese, Australian fella in Majok. You've got, there was one import Chris Obekpa, who was there through preseason, was injured, was cut, replaced by Brandon Ashley last minute, so he didn't have any of the preseason stuff. Not only that, but there was the Tall Black stuff during the World Cup, obviously affected the amount of time that the whole squad was able to be together to train with. Then you had the NBA thing where they went to America, played a couple games there against the Thunder and the Grizzlies, I think. And so that obviously affected their preseason as well, and it meant that they started 2 weeks later in the regular season than, well, not quite everyone else, because a couple other teams went over as well, but for some of these teams. So just all these things, add all that together, and that is already a recipe for a team that can only really be considered in a transitional year. But that's not the focus of management. Management wants to win now and win lots of games straight away while RJ Hampton's around, advertise this team when they've got the most eyes upon them, and being able to attract newer and better imports in the future and more of these next star guys coming down here. And as far as the next stars go, I don't think it really matters how they play. I think next star guys just want to know that they can be drafted out of this situation. So we'll find out how successful their Hampton thing is, specifically and exclusively down to what number he is drafted at. That's the only thing that's going to matter in terms of how that experiment goes. But everything else is this is why this team is 2-7. But then because of that, you've got this added pressure of trying to win now because this is the focus of the team. And this is why you talk yourself into a situation where you can bring Glenn Rice into this environment. And obviously this is not a stable environment. Obviously this is a completely volatile environment. There's questions about the, I know Mike Fitchett talked about, he didn't say it's because he's a bad coach or anything, but he did say his style of coaching and Dan Shamir's style of coaching didn't quite gel. Corey Webster called him the Jewish Jose Mourinho. When you think of Jose Mourinho as a football manager, there's certain connotations you have there about a guy who thinks really hard about the game, who has very strict philosophies and stuff like this. Well, this dude's barely had any time with his full, barely get time to train with these guys, let alone implement deep philosophical ideas about how he wants them to play and what structures and sets he wants to see. And it's just all these reasons why this team is not built to be a successful team this year. Because I still maintain that in terms of the quality on the roster, they're good enough to make the semi-finals, but they're just not going to because there's no cohesion there and they don't really have time to find the cohesion. So chucking Glenn Rice into that mix is just inconceivable. And then thinking that you have the structures to be able to help him. I mean, at this point, I just feel sorry for Glenn Rice. I don't know what he went down. I've seen I've read a lot about what he's done in previous clubs, and it's despicable. This is not a guy who really should be investing that much time, and he needs to help himself before anyone else should be bringing him halfway around the world to play in unfamiliar situations and a volatile team which is losing as it is. That's just it's almost cruel to him to put him in that situation, knowing that he's a troubled individual. It's astounding. And then of course, you've also had Matt Walsh yapping away at the NBL commissioner and complaining about fouls and things like this, as if the fouls are the reason that they're losing and not all the things I've just been talking about. Fouls are just like, if anything, it's a little cherry on top. I mean, of course, the Breakers struggle with fouls, but perhaps the reason they struggle with fouls, because I don't doubt that that's true. I don't want to look at the numbers because I don't have time for this, but I don't doubt that it's true that they've copped the bad end of some fouls. But guess what? This is a league notorious for imports coming in and struggling with how it's officiated. Every import, like Brandon Ashley leads the league in fouls. Well, guess what? He came into this league just before the season started. Of course he's going to struggle. Perhaps there's just a lot of bad defenders in this team as well. Not just bad, not specifically bad individual defenders, because there's a lot of good athletes, but just well, again, let's come back to the coaching. How are they structured? Well, I guess the coach hasn't really had time to worry about defense at this point, because he hasn't had time to be able to, oh my god, the whole thing is just such a smorgasbord of, I mean, excuses in a way. You could say that these are all, but this isn't the way that they're trying to do things, and oh my god, it's a bloody nightmare to think how far this club has fallen, and the bad decisions that keep being made to compound other bad decisions. And Glenn Rice was going to play on Sunday, just regardless of what intonations might have been made about, he was going to play. He was there. He turned up he traveled with the team. The news about it as well. Supposedly this happened Wednesday night, Thursday morning, as a little incident. The news didn't break until Saturday evening on the 1 o'clock news, which is also, if you're paying attention to the deep dive media side of things, that's not a coincidence either, because the Breakers PR fella used to work for TVNZ. So if an exclusive happens on TVNZ, which was exactly the case as well with Dylan Boucher's resignation, that's how you know the Breakers are trying to bury this story. And they waited to release the details about it, and they still say, oh, we don't know what's happening, we're investigating, you had to have known something had happened, and the fact that it took 3 days for it to become knowledge shows that they were trying to bury the story. The fact that they didn't do anything about it and expected him to play, and he had already travelled with the team and was in Perth by the time anyone found out about this in New Zealand. And he wasn't, it's not just we don't know what happened, we can't speculate on that kind of thing, but it's not just an incident where he was picked up by the police because he was just collateral in some other he was charged with something and is facing a court hearing this week. So it's not like there was nothing going on there. Something happened, and the fact that he was still going to play, the fact that they waited until after the NBL had told them that they had to suspend him, and then they decided to put in their internal punishment sort of thing. This is just damage control. This is poorly managed. Their whole media approach has been just shocking throughout the season. Even down to the fact that they, the way they buried some of their import signings, didn't really talk about them, focused on the new coach, the way they handle. I mean, I will accept there has been a lot of unprecedented things to have to deal with in terms of how the public perception goes. But for a long time, it was sliding under the radar. The Breakers aren't the biggest name in New Zealand sports, and a lot of people were just happy to go along with the idea that this is just a new era, new way of doing things. We're trying to pump up the hype and bring more of an NBA atmosphere to this whole thing, and a lot of people were cool with that, because if you don't dig a little deeper and look at some of the other things that are happening below the surface, then you don't notice. And it wasn't much of a big deal throughout a lot of the major media outlets in New Zealand, and that has changed now. I've been writing about this for months, pointing things out, and we've got people who have who know what they're talking about with basketball, who have been agreeing with things like this, and it's cool, okay, we're on the right track. Other fans are seeing this in the same way, but to the casual fan, I can understand how it would all slide under the radar. But that's not the case anymore, because when they brought in Glenn Rice and they brought in the headlines that came with this, and for it to go so immediately badly, well, now all of New Zealand is aware that this is a club in a bit of a shambles at this point, and let's just hope this is rock bottom, because I don't know where else, I don't know how much further down you can go from this, and I don't believe that the owners have come in. Matt Walsh isn't here to ruin the Breakers. Matt Walsh is trying to run a basketball club. He's just perhaps I don't know, maybe he's just not as good at it as he might have thought he would be, or maybe he is, but just that hasn't been able to accept the circumstances that are costing this team a chance to be successful this season. I have absolutely no idea, but the whole thing like just stinks, and it's a complete mess. And I just feel I've got past the point where I feel like I am doing a public good and pointing this stuff out. I'm now at the point where I'm like, well, everyone knows now, so I just kind of feel like a dick to have to keep talking about it. It just makes me feel sad at this point. What a mess this club has become, who used to be so high and mighty. As Alex Pledger said, once again, it was a dynasty. Drop the mic.
That's a pause for effect there.
Yes.
But we'll wrap it up there. You've already spun a almighty yarn there, despite also saying that you got nothing else. But yeah, we'll wrap it up there. Aotearoa Breakers, stay tuned for what's going to happen next, because I've got no fucking clue what is happening next with the New Zealand Aotearoa Breakers. Anything could happen from this point, and you know that the Nishi Cash will be all over it. And you know we don't give a fuck, so we're not here to pander to anyone. We're not here to make friends or cozy up to the organisation. We're here to keep it real.
That ship sailed.
For our fans, for our listeners, and that's what we do.
The only other thing I'll say is I still have not heard a relevant explanation for why Brandon Ashley played wearing, not Mika Vakona's, it was, although Mika Vakona's number's being worn by RJ Hampton this season, but technicality, he hasn't retired yet, whatever. But the reason for CJ Bruden's number to be worn by another player, why was that jersey? Why does that I've yet to hear an adequate explanation. To me, that's just like inconceivable that could happen. So let's chuck that one on the list as well, because I haven't actually mentioned that anywhere else.
Kia kaha, stay beautiful. Chirp chirp.